Our Around the World segment tonight, 12 people dead, nearly 50 injured in what appears to be a terror attack in Berlin. The man originally arrested by German authorities was a Pakistani migrant. He was later determined not to be the killer. But the German people are already pointing their fingers at Angela Merkel because this attack has all the earmarks of the attack in Nice, France from earlier this year that killed 86 people. The attack that was carried out by radical Islamic terrorists, refugees. For the past 2 years, the German people have suffered violence at the hands of Muslim refugees over and over and over, and Merkel's allowed it to continue. So who can blame the German people for blaming Merkel? Joining me now, Thomas L. Rhodes Fellow at the National Review, Ian Tuttle. Ian, thanks for being here.
Sure thing.
It's always good to see you. Ian, there is a right-wing Politico in Germany calling these 12 people who were killed in this attack Merkel's dead. Ian, honestly, if I were German, I would feel the same way here. Once we know the facts, for sure. I mean, allowing refugees into the nation without any vetting, we don't know who they are. It's leading, at the very least, it's leading to a hotbed of radical Islamic terror. I mean, in my opinion, the blood is on Merkel's hands.
Well, it's certainly leading to a situation of extreme cultural fragmentation. Where you have a number of different subgroups that are sort of, in conflict. Now, I think we do need to wait for the facts of this particular attack because, of course, as you said, Liz, the original person arrested has been released. Police said they didn't have enough to keep him. So we ought to wait before pinning it on refugees. What is clear, though...
No, you're absolutely right. And I want to clarify for my viewers, I wasn't insinuating that he was a refugee. I was saying it's possible, but even if he wasn't a refugee, the environment created by the influx of refugees is making it a breeding ground for this radical Islamic terror that we've seen, not just in this instance, but in the past 2 years in Germany.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, Germany has taken in more refugees from Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa than other European countries by a long shot, almost 1 million last year. I mean, that's an extraordinary number of people to be introducing into your country, and without really any sort of assimilating process. Germany's sense of sort of national identity being a fairly fragile thing to begin with since the Second World War. We can look to France, I think, though, for a really good example of how this sort of takes place, since they've been working with or sort of incorporating large elements of the Muslim world into French life for a lot longer. And you see that in the Bataclan and Nice and the rest. As far as the terroristic element of this goes, what I think is definitely clear is that we're now, two as a coincidence, three as a trend, and it's not just Nice, it's also Ohio State here in the United States. And so there's clearly a sense among people, either when they're directly associated with ISIS or sort of at the fringes, that they're figuring out ways to go after
the tactics. Right, and you're referring to these tactics, driving a car into groups of people. I mean, this isn't just copycat type terrorism here. These are directives from ISIS propaganda, from radical Islamic propaganda. They say to use cars, to use trucks, to bowl over civilians, to create the most terror, the most deaths here. It's not a coincidence whether or not this was a refugee or not. It's certainly an act of terror here. But going in, and one point I would want to add to the assimilation factor is the willingness to assimilate. It's not just the government process that goes into successful assimilation. It's migrants or refugees being willing to adopt new cultural trends, new cultural norms, and many of these refugees in Germany are not willing to do that. There are clerics that are coming with them that in fact are telling them that it's a sin, that they can't go against their culture, their Muslim culture from back in their homeland, and if they do, they will be punished. So the willingness to assimilate is a very important part of that.
Absolutely, and you certainly see that in France, where basically the large, to take the Algerian population, which is massive and sort of flooded France after the Second World War, was sort of the start of large-scale Muslim ghettoization, which you have outside Paris. That is a situation that's ripe for creating the types of conditions that lead to radicalization that you're talking about. The other thing that I think is worth keeping in mind with all of this, I've done reporting on refugee populations in the United States, and often when it comes to being attracted to radical ideologies, it's not necessarily the refugees themselves. It's often the first generation who are in this very awkward position if they haven't been sort of assimilated, haven't developed the love of country that a refugee might in many cases have. At least they have in the
Right.
past in the United States. Where they're in this awkward situation between feeling an affinity for their native country, so to speak, but being American or whatever the case might be, by birth, and they're not sure exactly who they are, and those people are extremely susceptible.
Right, they're
To
vulnerable, I
develop-
think, because they do have that lost identity almost. They're not sure which way to
right,
turn because in
right,
practicality they're westernized. In practicality they relate to the Western culture that their parents and their heritage tell them is wrong, tell them that they shouldn't like, tell them they shouldn't be a part of. I think it's almost the same mentality as in a larger scale here, I think feeling homeless in a way. They don't feel like their nation of heritage is their home because it's not. They've never been there or not since they were children, but they don't feel their new country is home because their parents are telling them that it's not. That's a very interesting point, I think, to make. Ian, I do want to move on to some of these examples of violence because, in my opinion, we can't overlook Merkel's role in this violence, whether or not it's a refugee, whatever we discover when the facts are in this to be. Merkel's role in this refugee crisis over the past year and a half has led to enormous violence for her people. She's put her people in a position of them being less safe, of them being not only attacked, but killed many, many times. I mean, this started all the way back last year, New Year's Eve in Cologne, where there were hundreds of sexual assaults, 24 rapes at the hands of migrants.
yeah, and as what was so striking, I think, about what happened in Cologne was that the local government was loath to acknowledge the facts of the situation, which I think is part of what's been so frustrating for many in Germany. Is not just that the policies seem unsafe or unwise, but that as they are having problems, the government is basically doubling down. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with the fact that Germany and the EU are in significant ways sort of synonymous. And so if Germany backs out of these types of lax policies, it looks basically like the EU doing that. And there's a lot of sort of Eurocrat ideology tied up in those decisions, which is worth keeping in mind. But that's quite right, and of course, all of this is leading in Germany to the rise of small far right parties that are gaining traction, especially at the local level. The way that Marine Le Pen's National Front has gained traction in France and the rest. So you're seeing people finally coming to the polls and responding electorally.
Right, and I think after 3 terms as chancellor, that's how long Angela Merkel has served. This is what she's given the German people. I mean, I'm not endorsing or making commentary on any of the candidates who would oppose her, but after 3 terms in 2017, I mean, I don't blame the German people one bit if they don't want her to be the steward of their nation anymore, because like I said at the beginning of the segment, if I were part of the German people, I would feel she's at fault.
Yeah, I mean, she certainly has been the leading figure in Europe when it comes to making the decisions about how they're going to handle the refugee migrant crisis. So a lot of this, from that sort of large scale political perspective, certainly does fall on her shoulders.
All right, Ian, that's all the time we have for today, but thanks so much for being here and have a Merry Christmas.